first of all, I just wanted to address the most frequently asked question. When people read the back cover summary, they often say, why? Why did you write a book about a girl trapped in a serpent's throat for 12 years? And I have two answers to that question. The first one takes us to Homer. One of the first stories that I read when I was young, yes, it was the abridged version, but it was the Odyssey of Homer, and I fell in love with the journey motif. And I set out to write a story where a girl was the lead. And the second answer to that question takes us to Rilke, the turn-of-the-century Czechoslovakian poet, is one of my favorites. And his advice to writers was love the questions. Now, my questions when I had a 9-month-old and was newly pregnant with my second was, what does it mean universally to heal from trauma? How do we find meaning in our darker experiences? Because the alternative is unconscionable and chaotic, where I know there are always patterns in what first appears to be chaos. Now I'm going to take you back 30 years ago. March, actually, 30 years ago, I got a letter from Stephen King after writing to him, and he wrote back. What's interesting about March 30 years ago was that was the 1st of March, and then the book was published on the 8th of March, 2018, precisely 30 years later from that letter that said, I wanted to be a writer, and Stephen was very generous with his advice. Interestingly enough, too, the official publication date of Serpent's Wake is International Women's Day, which was just a wonderful, happy accident. At the same time, I was going in to start 2 years of a psychology degree, and I was introduced to Viktor Frankl. And I read his, not in person, I read his book, I wished in person, Man's Search for Meaning. Now, if you're familiar with him, he was a psychiatrist and survived the Nazi death camps. And he wrote that we can survive just about anything if we can find meaning in it. He believed that we can choose between despair and freedom. And a person with trauma needs to be reminded that he or she has a choice to begin with. Despair is not inevitable, not even to a man who witnessed the horrors of Auschwitz. And he wrote this, which I think is particularly pertinent these days. It did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. So in 1988, as I read these lines at 17 years old, his book unlocked my mind. My questions, the ones that Rilke encouraged me to love, were roused when I read Frankl. At the same time, I discovered Marie-Louise von Franz, who said, it's easy to be a naive idealist, it's easy to be a cynical realist, it's quite another thing to have no illusions and still hold the flame. I grew up around traumatized refugees, war veterans, and indigenous people. I worked in a nursing home and then a homeless shelter. I spoke with sex workers and people who experienced domestic violence, and I saw patterns in the chaos of trauma. I saw we all had much in common. The path after trauma is archetypal. It's an allegory. That is a story that's loaded with universal symbols and metaphors, messages that cross cultures, ethnicities, genders, man-made boundaries, borders, and walls. The path after trauma contains elements of Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces and Clarissa Pinkola Estes' Women Who Run with the Wolves. We have helpers. We cross thresholds. We stand before the abyss. We face atonement. We encounter our gifts. We are given countless opportunities to develop compassion for ourselves and for others. And ultimately, we will experience the grace of new life in its varied forms. In story, we make the space to love the questions. We gaze into the reflecting pool that is story, and we craft our own meaning as we see, as C.S. Lewis said, we are not alone. This is what Serpent's Wake is about. Now, what I'd like to do is offer you a little bit of a film trailer. One of the bits of feedback that I got from this book was, I don't know what's going to happen next, so I don't want to spoil it. I just want to give you a little taste here and there and entice you. First, a note from the author's note, which helps frame the work a bit for you. Just as in a dream or a fairy tale, the characters of this story each embody an aspect of one mind. In short, we are the captain, we are the bar pig, we are the poet, etc., and we are even what becomes of the snake. All of the characters in this story seek some form of redemption and finally integration. True to the fairy and folk tales that inspired this novel, major characters have their counterparts, that is, the hunter has the captain, the father the doctor, etc., to balance their traits as they light the arduous climb toward wholeness. Lastly, the unnamed coastlines, nationalities, blurred ethnic markers are deliberate. While details of the story texture a traceable geographical journey, a softening of labels reflects the deeply universal experience of trauma and recovery. And the resulting story intends to be what readers themselves bring to the shores. It's drawn from the shared experience that is the courageous, determined, and expansive emergence from trauma. Now, from part one, A Sea of Night. Now, thank you, Will, for the opening line, which he whispered to me when we went to see Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs 2. I leaned over, and he said, "I know you are brave." I know you are brave, you of the many faces and the one, you who have crossed mountains and seas in the search that always follows the bite. Your story is ready now, steeped in brine and dried upon stones, its many parts sung together again for you. Hear it like wolves calling down the moon, like waves caressing a ship on a fine day. See it like a table repaired, a place set for all. Believe in a sacred place that's yours, waiting to receive all that you set out to become. One afternoon, just outside a village quite like this, a child was swallowed whole by a serpent. The young girl's parents were unaware, mere paces from where she played, of what slid through their budding orchard. While her father stacked wood near the barn and while mother kneaded dough in the kitchen, the unthinkable happened to their only child. The snake, enormous, black, had been roused from a deep century-old slumber. It woke to the tremor of silver bells sewn into the hem of the little girl's dress and nosed up, 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 through a crevice urged by a terrible hunger to eat that song. It curled against a sun-baked stone in the orchard and waited. Still as a fallen tree, the serpent watched. Tiny twin reflections of the child hovered on the polished night of those eyes. Later scene. Rushing water woke her. The child's cheeks were wet. Water poured. She coughed. Assessing her condition, she was in the dark and pulled along by this darkness as if carried by some mean current. Then a heave of memory. She realized she was curled inside the snake, her dress clinging about her. She tried to right herself, but her body was limp, swept up in a tide turning against its own private moon. She could not move, could not weep, the darkness, absolute. She wondered, do the dead think they're dead? God save me, she cried. Nothing. This close, sticky dark held her taut as wet rope. Then later. Something woke her. She listened. Silence. Had the serpent's heartbeat stopped? No, but nearly. She stretched a little further here, a little further there. She climbed. She pulled on the remaining tatters of her dress, and carefully, with a bit of twisting and a bit of turning, she found herself reaching the back of the serpent's mouth. With her fingers, she felt teeth, twin rows of curved blades. Works better than the microphone. Sorry. In the darkness to which she had grown so accustomed, she felt the serpent's thick tongue, a crossroads at midnight. She paused. Don't think, said the voice. That was not the voice. With something more brazen than courage, she pushed against the roof of the beast's mouth. Listening for that barely beating heart, feeling with every fiber of muscle for the slightest awareness, nothing. Again, she pushed, and this jaw was a stiff, unoiled hinge, but slowly it gave. Her arms trembled, and every few minutes the dump went that cold, cold heart. With a heave, the girl slid between sheathed fangs. She fell to the ground with a thud, tearing away the last remnant of her dress. She felt earth on her hands. Darkness. Something was caught. Her head was not free. She touched the base of her skull and pulled. Her hair trailed behind her right back to the lips of the sleeping beast. She shuddered, thinking at any moment the serpent would snatch her up with finality this time, but it didn't. Instead, she felt the occasional reptilian wash of the sleeping serpent's breath roll across the ground like fog. The girl blinked, lighting up her own dark now. Both hands on her hair, she turned. Even in that blackness, she sensed it in immense face shining, the trail of her hair cascading from its mouth like a tongue. She began to crawl, feeling her way 1 inch at a time away from the beast. Head down, neck and shoulders tight, pulling her hair free. Her hair slid from the creature's mouth with each pull. Another inch, another foot, another yard. It sizzled across scaly lips. Kneeling, she turned to free the last strands, but they were stuck. She yanked them from her scalp. And with that, there was movement. She listened, hands tented on the ground. She heard the serpent's head crackle with a rise. She held her breath. She heard it gag. Its great fangs flexed in a yawn, and a silver bell threw a spark. Heard the tongue flick once as the great serpent returned to its repose. This is my last segment, a little bit later. One of my favorite scenes. In the dark, she listened to the night noises, eyes wide under the moon. She twinkled with snow dust. She straightened her spine with a crackle. Had she grown another inch this minute? Which way? She closed her eyes. An answer. This way. She listened. The stars were many. The moonlight was kind to her eyes. Long ago, before, she would have been afraid at night, walking all alone, but not this night. Not under these stars and this moon, so hard-earned, so desperately hers. This night was holy, a word that now surpassed anything she ever thought she knew about it. Holy. The sky was gracious. A sea of night shimmered, a cosmic welcome, so intimate. She trusted that so long as she kept walking, she would find home. Holy. Every step she took, she stretched and grew a little more. Holy. So long since she'd seen such stars, she spun to meet infinity and walked as if led by the hand. I'm in the dark again, she thought, and what a beautiful dark it is. She wasn't worried about the hunter coming after her. She wasn't worried about losing her way or freezing to death. She wasn't even cold. I am life in all this darkness. And life itself was surrounded by more. The frosted trees cast sober glances. The great owl spoke in the pines. Icicles held fast in stillness. Once there was only silence, and it frightened her, but now silence had a multitude of voices. You without a face speak to me through dirt and fire. She thought of how she grieved her God, how she mistook silence for absence. And through that voice, that was not a voice, she heard, I bear all. And that's when she heard it. One wolf, a pair, and then a choir. A whole pack burst the night, and she was not afraid. She knew their voices. You are ours, we are we. She walked each step lighter, filled with night. She had mountains of treasure after such a season of want. She slipped across the snow like a spirit, listening to the wolves until they faded. She moved across the hills, following an arc of stars that pulled her home.